Good morning, everyone. I'm Karlyn Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our final pre-election Election Watch panel. We'll be back on November 5th, midday, to look at what the results that we have thus far. Today, I'm joined by my AEI colleagues, Norman Ornstein and Michael Barone, and also by John Fortier of BPC and Henry Olsen of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We have a lot of ground to cover this morning, and I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists a few questions. They've promised crisp, concise answers so that we can move through a lot of material. But first, let me summarize the polls. Yesterday, President Trump said that he wasn't running scared and that he criticized the polls once again. But let's look at the poll numbers since our last election watch. Of the 177 major polls conducted since September 15th, Biden has been at or above 50% at 133 of 177. And Trump has been at or above 45% in only 31. His approval rating is at 43% and it barely moves. We're going to start today with John Fortier, who is the editor of the newly available and digitized forum, After the People Vote, A Guide to the Electoral College. This slim volume is all you need to understand the complexities of the Electoral College. John is also an expert in early and absentee voting. And John, that's where I'd like to start today. What % of the population do you think will vote early or absentee? And could you tell us a little bit about what we're learning from states such as Texas?
Well, I think the technical answer is a lot. Many people are going to vote, many more than ever, really a huge increase, both in vote by mail and in the total of early voting in person and vote by mail. Just some context, we've been seeing a lot more voting in this realm in our elections before. So we saw 41% of the American people vote either by mail or early in person in 2016. The early results are stunning. As states one by one start to open up the voting process, you see enthusiasm going towards these early methods of voting. I want to give some credit to Michael McDonald, a University of Florida professor who really spends a lot of time counting these things. But as of today, 31,677,000 votes have been cast that we know of. There were roughly 56 million of them in 2016. So we are already well onto that road. Are we going to see, I think we will see certainly over 50% of the vote be early in person plus mail voting. I think we could certainly see up to 65, maybe 70% if you add those two numbers together. So that's a big number. Some other facts quickly, not all states have party registration, so we don't know about the whole of that voting, but of the states that have it, we see that about 53% of the voters are Democratic and 24% Republican. Again, reflecting what we see in the polls, that Democrats are more enthusiastic, especially about voting by mail, than are Republicans. And then one other note is Texas. Texas does a lot of early in-person voting. They usually have big numbers, but they already, and having opened it relatively recently, have 45.3% of their total vote, not just the early vote, of their total vote in 2016 have voted early with many days to go. So you see these things really stepping up. We could talk about lines too. Lines, we see lines out the door. Those are partly because of enthusiasm and partly because of social distancing, but we're seeing a lot of it.
Thanks, John. At our last session, you were less pessimistic than a lot of other commentators about whether we would know the results on election night or the next day. Do you still feel that way?
Well, I do, but again, there are several factors here. There certainly is much more pressure on the counting of the vote, and the exact numbers that we're going to see are going to be delayed. But we often know the winner before we know the final count in the state or nationally. And so it all depends on the margin. If we have a close election on election night, close in key states, then we may see some significant delays. But if it's even moderately clear that a candidate has won in states, those states could easily be called on election night. We've seen a number of lawsuits going back and forth with changes to deadlines of absentee voting, changes to witness requirements. The Supreme Court often not allowing those changes to go forward, although yesterday in a case in Pennsylvania, a state Supreme Court ruling, they let it stand. So we're seeing some changes there. One state that I would watch is Pennsylvania, where both because of the Supreme Court ruling yesterday, which is allowing votes to come in after Election Day with a postmark, but also because there has been no agreement to count votes early. The state legislature is opposed to that. And so I think Pennsylvania will be a state that's doing a lot more voting, could be a key state and will be delayed. Other states like Wisconsin, Arizona, some reason to believe that they may be quicker. Michigan maybe a little tougher, not quite as bad as Pennsylvania. Florida, even though it could be close, they tend to process things pretty quickly. Those are the types of states I'm watching, just because those could be swing states or the states that really matter if it's close. And the one I think that we would watch the most is Pennsylvania.
John, how many states actually waited till Election Day to count the ballots? I know there are lawsuits pending, so that number may be changing, but is it what, about 8 to 10?
Yeah, that number is changing, and so I don't have that number. It is a number of states wait till Election Day, or some have very short periods beforehand. The one big change in Michigan has added an extra day. I think some wanted more than that. And that is a factor. Again, I think we should look both at the fact of states that don't process ballots early, but also states that allow ballots to come in late. Combination of those factors, sometimes with other things combined, can lead to a longer count. Many states, though, however, even if they have a short time to count ballots, some of them do it actually at the polling place. Some of them do it at a very local level. And we don't expect those states to be delayed. Wisconsin is an example of that. So it's a complicated equation to figure out how these things fit together. But certainly Pennsylvania, I think with on both ends having some potential issues, is one that I'm watching.
John, one final question. What do you make of the reports that Republicans have registered a lot more new voters than Democrats have? How will that affect the calculus?
Well, I'm not sure how it's going to affect the calculus in terms of early voting. I mean, again, Democrats are more enthusiastic about voting by mail, so that is the case. I think it's always difficult to tell in these registration numbers whether we're picking up a lagging indicator of Democrats who've been voting Republican, Western Pennsylvania Democrats who feel more at home in the Republican Party but hadn't changed their registration until more recently, for example. But those are good numbers in a sea of not so great numbers for Republicans. So maybe there's hope for Republicans that there is more of a surge that is not being detected. But again, some of it could be a lagging indicator from people who've been moving to the Republican Party but hadn't switched their registration in past elections.
Thank you very much, John. Before we turn to Michael, I'd like to welcome our C-SPAN audience, and I'd also like to thank our staff, Samantha Goldstein, Jackie Clements, and Stephanie Dodd for all the help they've given us in putting this event together, and also the wonderful AEI events team, Sarah Olsen and Sammy Ponzer. We're really grateful to all of you for the help that you've given us. Michael, we're turning it over to you now, and let's start looking at some of the Senate contests. At our last election watch, you said the Democrats had a serious chance of recapturing the Senate. Is that still where you are today?
Yes, it is. It's an interesting contrast with 2016, Karlyn. In 2016, you had 4 incumbent Republican senators who ran ahead of Donald Trump in their states and were reelected. Marco Rubio, Richard Burr in North Carolina, Rubio in Florida, Pat Toomey, Pennsylvania, Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. Those were all seriously contested races. This year, it's different. You've got in the 2 states where Republican senators are running for re-election in states carried by Hillary Clinton, you got Susan Collins running ahead of Donald Trump, but well behind her Democratic challenger, Susan Gideon, the Secretary of State, and Cory Gardner in the one poll we've got in Colorado. It seems to be running about even with Trump, not sufficiently ahead really to be competitive if that one poll is correct. But what's really interesting to me, 5 incumbent Republican senators and 1 Republican in a Republican held seat are running behind Donald Trump. Martha McSally in Arizona, way behind Donald Trump and her Democratic challenger. Tom Tillis, Joni Ernst in North Carolina and Iowa are running behind their Democratic challengers. And in 3 other races, Republicans have just narrow leads in states where Trump is well ahead. That includes Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, Steve Daines in Montana, and in one poll, Roger Marshall in Kansas. So Republican incumbents seem not to have been able to establish records of their own that would commend them to voters, not only those who support Donald Trump, but to some who aren't.
Let's look at a few other contests. The two races in Georgia, where do you see those at this point?
Well, those races seem to be very close. You've had an increasing turnout in Georgia, and you've had an increasing number of African-American residents and voters in Georgia. The middle-class Black majority suburbs of Atlanta have been increasingly important in elections there. And they have many people moving from the metro areas, from the Chicagos and Detroits of the north to metro Atlanta. And then making Georgia a more Republican state, a more Democratic state, excuse me. And so you've got David Perdue, the incumbent Republican, is running just barely ahead of his Democratic challenger, John Ossoff, the guy who narrowly lost the race in the upscale 6th congressional district, that special election a couple of years ago. In the other race, you've got the race in November for the open seat vacated by the resignation of Johnny Isakson. That race looks to be its current race in November will establish the two top vote getters that are going to go on to a general election in February. Rudolph Warnock, the Democrat, only serious Democrats, clearly going to make that runoff. And the question is whether appointed Senator Kelly Loeffler or Congressman Doug Collins are going to make it in, but they've been running just about even. So that race could end up determining the majority of the US Senate next February.
Here are a few races that you haven't mentioned. Let's talk about Alaska, Kansas, and of course, Alabama is the one race that everyone expects to Democrat.
Well, Alaska is a race where Dan Sullivan, who narrowly won his race 6 years ago, independent who's got support from the Democratic Party. Sullivan seems to be leading. He's not seeming to get a majority in the polls. At least some Democrats are saying that's a close election. You mentioned, in addition, Alaska and
Kansas.
In Kansas, we have very little polling, but the Democratic candidate is a former Republican office holder, and that's a state where the upscale voters in Johnson County, Kansas, next to Kansas City, Missouri. Metro Kansas City has got most of its upscale voters live on the Kansas side of the border, and they have been making what's been reliably Republican Kansas a less Republican state because they've been attracted to Democrats like many upscale voters in suburban areas around the country. And so that's one that's up for grabs. You mentioned also Alabama. That looks like a one sure pickup for the Republican Party to add to their current 53 seats. Doug Jones of Alabama is running way ahead of where Democratic presidential candidates run in Alabama, but that's not nearly enough to win in that state. And so he's likely to be rejected and Republicans will gain. But the only other possible Republican gain, it appears in the current run of states, is in my old home state of Michigan, where the Republican John James came within 6 points of beating incumbent Debbie Stabenow 2 years ago, is running just about 4 points behind Gary Peters, Democratic one-term US Senator, who at one point had the lowest degree of substantive identification of any US senator. So that's a possible pickup and a possible good news for Republicans in what otherwise appears to be a bad news night for them in US Senate contests.
Thanks, Michael. None of these Senate candidates, to my knowledge, has tied themselves in any way to Donald Trump in recent advertisements overall. And some of them are going so far to say that they will be a check on a Joe Biden presidency. Is that something that usually happens at this point when races are at the state they are today?
I think it is something that usually happens, and I'm surprised it hasn't happened more. You've got when Joe Biden has been unwilling to state where he stands on packing the Supreme Court, which many professional Democrats are in favor of and been talking about, but which polls very badly with general election voters. I would expect Republican candidates in close races to say, stop the Democrats from taking over, adding justices to the Supreme Court, packing the court. President Roosevelt made a mistake when he did it in 1937. It's a mistake now, and so forth. That I would expect that we've seen a little of that from Tom Tillis in North Carolina. I would expect to see more of it from some of these incumbent Republicans who are failing to keep up with Donald Trump in their home state polls.
Michael, did these toss-up races usually break in one direction or another, as they did in 1980?
Well, Senate races often do. I mean, 1980, I remember Republicans won 12 of the 14 closest races and won the majority of U.S. senators for the first time in 24 years. That was a huge surprise at that time. The same set of seats, 5 of the 7 closest races went to the Democrats 6 years later. They won a Senate majority that hadn't been anticipated. If you go back to 2012, Democrats won 7 of the 9 closest races, kept their majority in the Senate. 2014, Republicans won 5 of the 7 closest races. They gained a majority in the Senate. So if all the close races go one way, I could see a Senate that could end up, instead of 46 Democrats as it does today, with as many as 55 Democrats. If all the close races go against the Democrats, which seems unlikely, you may see a Senate that still has 53 Republican senators.
Michael, one more question. People split their tickets less and less than they did in the past. Do you expect that to change, or are we too polarized for that to happen?
I think that we're too polarized for that to happen. I think that, political scientists back in the 1950s said it would be great if we had one clearly liberal party, one clearly conservative party. Their prayers were answered, but it took about 40 years. In the kind of politics that we have today, where cultural issues of personal values are important, people tend to stick with their party up and down the ballot because their views on moral issues are not something that changes or wobbles or it changes very much depending on the unemployment rate or other external factors. So I expect that period will last about 40 years, but I think you're going to have to find somebody else to do election watch in 2040 or 2042 to tell you why it's happened.
Thank you very much, Michael. Norm, you're up next. What do you expect to happen in a lame duck if Biden wins and the Democrats control the Senate and the House? And then what happens if Biden wins, but the Republicans still control the Senate?
So if we think about the lame duck session, and almost certainly there will be one, at least of some sort, remember, the Republicans will still have the Senate and the presidency all the way through until January 3rd. I don't think we will see much of an inclination among Republicans in the Senate to do something big on, say, the COVID recovery, economic stimulus front in a way that would actually benefit a Joe Biden administration by having the economy settle down and dealing with a COVID crisis that infectious disease specialists expect is going to ramp up in a fairly big way. Unless it's a triage measure. I think what we'll see is probably a lot of inaction. But the other thing we have to keep in mind on that front, Karlyn, is that, as John talked about Pennsylvania, if there are serious questions about the election, and that includes questions as we go forward about whether there are contested slates of electors, that will be decided by the next Congress on January 6th. But I expect we will see along the way a Senate and probably a president doing what they can during that lame duck session to try and make sure the outcome comes out the way that they want. We're going to have an acrimonious period. If the Republicans continue to control the Senate and Joe Biden wins, I think we get even more of a sense of not wanting to do things that will no longer benefit their party in an electoral sense, but that would make Joe Biden's life easier. And we would expect, I think, a great deal of tension and gridlock as we move forward into the next year, including on confirmations, not just of potentially judges, but of executive branch appointees in the new administration.
Norm, you've watched a lot of transitions over time, and I think the transition planning has clearly begun already. If there is a Biden presidency, and this appears to be one area where the Trump administration is cooperating with the Biden team. AEI published a book of memos many years ago on Richard Newsted's views about transition. What should we watch for if Biden's elected in a Biden transition?
I'm not sure we're going to see a great deal of continued cooperation. President Trump will not be a happy camper if he loses the presidency. And a lot of his cabinet members have not indicated a great willingness to work closely with the Biden people. I'm expecting a more tumultuous and difficult transition if we see a Biden victory. Obviously, some of it depends on when that victory takes place. Remember, a transition that would take place under a set of circumstances where we don't know the election result and where we may have to go until the new Senate and House to determine slates of electors. That's at least a small possibility. It's not a zero probability here. That's going to throw the transition into complete turmoil. Other than that, it's really going to be, I think, a trench warfare in a fashion that we haven't seen so much before. Transitions have varied greatly. Some of them we have seen, and that includes, in some instances, a transition within the same party, where the outgoing people are not all that interested in making life easy for those who are coming in. We've had others that have been models, and to me, the real model in modern times is the one from George W. Bush to Barack Obama, for which Bush and his chief of staff, Josh Bolten, deserve a great deal of credit. But whether we have that this next time, I'm skeptical about it. One other point I would make, and it gets back to what Michael said about the Georgia race. One of the things that's concerned a lot of people as we look towards the new Congress, and remember it's January 6th when Congress certifies the electoral votes, and if there are contested electors. And there's been some real question about what happens if Democrats pick up just enough seats to get to 50. And then if it's a 50-50 Senate with the Vice President, Mike Pence, still in that chair for another 14 days. But if the second Georgia seat, as is almost certain, is not decided in November and won't be decided until February, that I believe will be a vacant seat. And that would give Democrats a 50-49 edge until February. So we could have a really interesting and unusual dynamic here if Democrats don't win most of those close races. And if it's an election that's a lot tighter or much more murky than we see now.
Thanks, Norm. A lot of names are being floated as possible members of a Biden cabinet. Can Biden satisfy both the progressives and the moderates? We've already seen some progressive pushback on some of the names of, let's say, the chief of staff and some of the front runners that are being considered for that position. And then the second question here, and I wonder whether you envision any Republicans serving in a Biden administration. And that some of the names that have been mentioned have been insiders and outsiders: Meg Whitman, Charlie Baker, governor of Massachusetts, Jeff Flake, John Kasich, and Biden has a close friend in Fred Upton, and that's another name that's being mentioned. How do you see those two questions?
Well, on the former front, the Democratic Party has been quite surprisingly or strikingly united to this point when it comes to the election itself. That'll change to some degree if in the aftermath of a Biden victory, where there really will be a lot of push and pressure to make sure that the different forces get some share of power in the new administration. And one of the interesting elements there is that, we've heard, of course, Biden has pretty much committed to having an African-American woman, if and when he gets an opportunity on the Supreme Court, that there will be significant numbers of people of color in the cabinet. We're seeing African-Americans saying they don't want to be in the leadership. They don't want to settle simply for the traditional slots of housing or HHS. It wouldn't surprise me that we see an African-American woman as Attorney General. I think we're going to see a number of posts of that sort, or as Secretary of State and as Secretary of State, untraditional posts. We're going to see a lot more push and pressure on places like the Secretary of Treasury. And there, I think it's almost a certainty that Biden will not pick somebody with a background on Wall Street. It'll be somebody from a different kind of background. I'm very skeptical that it would be an Elizabeth Warren, in part for pragmatic reasons, that you would throw into at least some question at an early stage a Senate seat at a time when you might need a lot of those. If it's a 55 seat Democratic majority, which is a remote possibility, that might be different. But I don't think we'll see that happening. Biden is going to be able, I think, because there are a lot of prime posts out there, to be able to satisfy different factions in different ways. I do see a significant number of Republicans going into a Biden administration, and that might include, for example, a Dan Coats going back as Director of National Intelligence. It could include a Tom Ridge coming back into the administration, along with the ones that you've mentioned, in different places, including probably more other than those symbolic slots, ambassadorships and others. Biden is going to start out, I think, beyond any question, trying to show that he is going to be president of all the people and that he wants to have a bipartisan approach. The real question is going to be what happens after January 3rd with or after January 20th, I should say, with a Democratic president and possibly a Democratic House and Senate, and whether the Republican Party in the Senate decides that they'll follow the same approach that they did at the beginning of the Obama administration and filibuster most major initiatives. Then we'll see, when the rubber hits the road, how long we can stay in a feel-good bipartisan fashion.
Great. Norm, let's talk a little bit about foreign policy in a Biden administration. I mean, Trump has certainly had some successes in the Middle East, and he's gotten bipartisan credit for those. Where do you expect to see the biggest differences between a Trump and a Biden administration in foreign policy?
So first, we're going to see Biden probably on January 20th, after the inauguration, getting back into the Paris Accords. We're going to see him make a major effort to rebuild the NATO alliance. I expect he will reach out very early to Japan and South Korea to try and build stronger relationships there, taking on China in that region in a different fashion than Trump has. Probably erasing the tariffs, but moving more aggressively on a couple of fronts, including the geopolitical one, reaching out more to our traditional allies there, but also taking a harder line on human rights with China and Hong Kong. I expect that we're going to see a real struggle, though, on the trade front, something that's there simply because we don't have the same kind of trade architecture that we had in the past. I also expect that we'll see on the immigration front a different approach towards countries in Central America, trying to provide more aid and more ability for countries like Guatemala and Salvador, so that we don't get quite the same flow and flood of people seeking asylum on the southern border. None of those are going to be easy, but I think we're going to see a very different approach in a lot of places on foreign policy. And of course, Iran will see an attempt to move back into the nuclear deal in some fashion.
Thank you. Norm, you're a real expert on campaign finance, and we've all seen just eye-popping sums spent in so many of these races thus far. Do you expect campaign finance reform to be on the front burner for a Biden administration, or are you happy with the way the system's evolving? I mean, certainly there's a lot of dark money still in the system overall, but you also have just an extraordinary increase in the number of small donors through the apparatuses that both the Republican and the Democratic Party have. How do you see campaign finance today as somebody who's followed it for a long, long time?
Well, first, I would expect that in the new Congress, H.R. 1, as it was the last time, will be a fairly major and sweeping set of democracy reforms, and that'll include some campaign finance reform. It'll include trying to bring back the Disclose Act, which barely failed in 2009 on a filibuster in the Senate, that would provide more disclosure for dark money. And by the way, that will be opposed by some 501c3 groups, including ones that would traditionally be for campaign finance reform because they don't want to disclose their donors. But I would expect that to happen. I would expect more of an incentive for small donors and an attempt to move back in a fashion away from having this big and dark money. But there isn't going to be a lot of success on that front. Of course, both parties have taken advantage of it this time. Democrats have raised a lot of money from large donors. But as you say, the heartening thing is the tremendous increase in small donors, and that's in part because of the ease of being able to use the internet to get small donations there that can add up very, very quickly. An incredible amount of money coming in that way. Of all the democracy reforms that I expect the Democrats will pursue, I think this will be lower on their priority list, except for the things that I mentioned, like disclose, and higher on the list is going to be voting rights and voting reforms.
How much does money matter, Norm? And let's look at a race like South Carolina, where Jamie Harrison has raised so much more money than Lindsey Graham. How much do you think it really matters? And does it matter at a certain point in the campaign?
Yeah, I think what really matters is getting enough money to get your message across. And certainly that's not been a problem either for Jamie Harrison or for Lindsey Graham. In an election like this, where attitudes are hardened going in, that may not matter as much, the amount of money that you raise. But where it can make a difference is in the get out the vote efforts. Those are expensive. Making sure that you have transportation for people to get to the polls, that you get a lot of messages out there about how to vote and what mistakes to avoid, that can make a difference in a lot of these races. What's also happened is that in races where Democrats would not normally be competitive, where you aren't going to be able to have even the money to get the message across, and let's face it, a cacophonous environment where it takes a lot to get that message across. They've been able to compete in places where they otherwise would not be able. And that in turn makes it harder for Republicans because they have to send resources to states where otherwise they wouldn't have to worry about it at all. So money makes a difference. It's not going to determine the outcome of elections, but it can really help you to broaden that playing field.
Thanks very much, Norm. And Henry, we're going to turn to you. We're already beginning to hear stories about a wave election like 1964 or 1980. In the latest polls, Biden has about a 10-point lead in the national polls overall. Do you see a wave building?
There are certainly signs that a wave is going to be building, that the consistent leads of Democrats in the generic ballot is one sign. The large leads of Biden in the national polls are another. The closeness of many Senate races that Republicans should be well ahead in is a third, or in some cases, Republicans who should be ahead behind, like Joni Ernst in Iowa. So there's a lot of evidence that a wave could be building. There is some evidence that it might not be, which is a number of state polls that show Trump doing much better in swing states. The New York ABC Washington Post poll today had Trump only 1 point behind in North Carolina, had Senator Thom Tillis behind by only 2. North Carolina actually has a history of slightly underpolling Republicans, not necessarily this poll, but as generally as a polling average. So there's a lot of signs that a wave is building, but there are some growing signs that maybe it's not. So while the odds are in favor of a big Democratic win, I wouldn't go to the bank yet.
The ABC Post poll this morning that showed North Carolina a lot closer than some of the other polls have suggested. Do you see that as a sign that the polls are tightening in other places, or do we just have that one?
There are other polls that have it closer. There's a UNF poll in Florida that has Biden up by only 1 point today. Another one of those polls that I think was either released late last night or just this morning. There are a number of swing state polls that show Biden's lead not lengthening after the bad debate that President Trump had, whereas the national polls all showed that lengthening. So it's increasingly the case that swing state polls are not ratifying what national polls are showing with respect to Biden's lengthening lead in the last 2 weeks. And that's something to look more deeply at.
You mentioned the debate, and I think everyone would agree that Trump has been sort of flailing in his attempts to define Biden. What can he do in this debate to define Biden, or is it just too late because it's a referendum on Trump?
I'd say it's largely too late at this point. That I don't doubt that he will try. Bill Stepien released an email or released a letter yesterday saying that he's going to make sure to ask Biden about the alleged corruption of his son, Hunter Biden, during the third debate. So, it wouldn't be President Trump if he didn't try and define Biden in a way. But what he really should be doing is defending his own record more. And that's something he's also been flailing to do. Yesterday's comments on a phone call and then kind of repeated in his campaign rallies, talking about people being tired of COVID, are just not the right way to defend his record. That the polls clearly show that people remain scared and worried about COVID. That's particularly true among people who are greater chance of dying, people his age or older. And the president continues to show a distinct tone deafness with respect to the mood of the American electorate.
You said that Trump should be defining himself, but one issue that's been really quite interesting is the economy, because Trump still leads on it, but the economy didn't help Republicans at all in 2018, and there's some evidence that it's certainly not helping him now. Because
There's some polls out that show something very interesting, that when people are asked in the same poll, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? A majority answer yes. When they say, is the country better off? A clear majority answers no. And the economy is a personal question largely. And what we saw in 2018 is people, particularly in the suburbs, who were benefiting from the tax cut and from the rip-roaring economy, choosing to ignore that in spades. The defining feature of the modern Republican Party seems to be a consistent ability to deny reality, and the idea that somehow they're talking about the economy louder is going to change that around just, again, misses the mood of the American people. American people want a strong economy and a president and a party that represents their values. And if they see the Republicans and President Trump as not being that, they will take a chance on the Democrats.
Thanks, Henry. One final question for you. At our last Election Watch, you identified 4 different groups of potential Trump successors. I wonder if you could revisit those, perhaps starting with Ben Sasse and his comments this week.
Well, yeah, Ben Sasse is Hamlet on the Potomac in many ways. He's been complaining in his Trump speech for over 6 years about how both parties don't offer solutions, but has yet to offer any of his own. But he would fall into one of the 4 camps. The 4 camps were the imperial successors, people who I define as pithily more Trump, less tweet. The restorationists, people who want to return to a largely pre-Trump Republican Party. That's the group that Ben Sasse would fall into. The young reformers, people who want to take Trump's insights about the changing nature of America in the world and at home seriously, but purge it of most of its discordant elements. And then the moderate outsiders. Imperial successors would be people like Don Jr. or Ivanka or Mike Pence or somebody else who would claim lineage from Trump in some way and be a kinder, gentler version while mainly stoking the same issues. And the restorationists would be people either from the strong right, like a Ted Cruz, or increasingly a Kristi Noem that is calling for more of a Tea Party-ish Republican Party, or a Nikki Haley or a Ben Sasse, who would basically be running as the establishment of the Republican Party. Young reformers are people like Josh Hawley or Tom Cotton or Marco Rubio, who are breaking ground on American foreign policy and American domestic policy and urging significant changes. And moderate outsiders would be people like a Larry Hogan or a Charlie Baker or even an Elise Stefanik, who are distinctly more centrist and distinctly not part of any existing faction, who would perhaps attract a following among people who want something completely new.
Is there any faction that has an advantage right now, or is it basically just name identification?
Well, with respect to the individuals, it's a name identification. But I tend to believe that the what is more important than the who, that the alignment of voters eventually determines who the nominee is rather than going from the top down. And I think that's the interesting question, is that there's clearly people who want a restorationist view. There's purely people who would like to see a Trump-like figure. But I think that there's a very strong potential for majority, or at least a plurality in the early rounds of primary voting behind the young reformers crowd, if they're able to both articulate a good message and find an attractive messenger sometime by 2023.
Thank you very much, Henry. You've all been remarkably concise and crisp in your answers. There are some other areas that we haven't covered at this point, and I think, Norm, I'll give you the first question, and this is, David Wasserman said yesterday that he expected a gain of about 5 to 15 seats for the Democrats in the House. What can we expect in the House? Will it be a more moderate Democratic caucus based on the Democrats you're seeing around the country?
So if you look at the Democrats who won in 2018 and who are going to be reelected or in 2020, and the places where they're likely to make gains, they are more of the moderate center-left variety than they are of a more radical left posture. The Democratic Party continues to be a party of coalitions. They're going to have an easier time in some ways building a majority and building unity there, but it's not a unity that can leave out those moderates, and they're the ones who continue to be most vulnerable if we look ahead to 2022. And what we've seen from Speaker Pelosi is a great sensitivity to making sure that nothing happens that would put them in jeopardy. You know, having said that, I expect a very aggressive House of Representatives, a belief that after 4 years of Donald Trump, it's time to do some more sweeping changes. And the question is going to be how much Joe Biden puts a brake on some of those things to try and keep a little bit more towards the center left.
John, a quick question about governors. Are there any races that we should be watching? I think there are 11 governors up this time. And also a quick look at state legislators and the ones where you've had trifectas, where you could see some significant changes that might affect not only policy agendas, but redistricting in 2022. John?
Yeah, the governor's front is not so exciting this time. It's a smaller class of governors up. Really, the one we're watching is in Montana with Greg Gianforte and Mike Cooney, and that's a possible gain for Republicans, but really kind of a toss-up at this point. Yes, there are some state legislative gains that we expect Democrats to make gains in the number of seats and in some chambers. A place like Minnesota is a place where they might move to taking a trifecta, having the governorship and both houses of the legislature. That would impact redistricting. Some of the other states where they might gain, in Arizona or Iowa, they're probably not going to gain. They don't have the governorship. They're not going to gain a trifecta, but they could break up the Republican trifecta. But it wouldn't really affect redistricting. Those are states that have a non-political redistricting of a sort. North Carolina is a state that Democrats are hoping to do well. They'd have to take both houses to get the trifecta. I think that's probably too much, but interestingly, the legislature there doesn't need the governor to redistrict. So even taking one house would make a difference for them. And then Norm mentioned earlier, the big one that Democrats are hoping for and is more in the realm of possibility, I think probably still not leaning that way, but is Texas. Texas, that would be a big shock for Republicans to lose the ability to not only govern with all branches being in the Republican hands, but also to redistrict after this election. So certainly places to watch. And again, we expect Democratic gains broadly in the number of seats and certainly some chambers as well.
Michael, do you think that the Supreme Court nomination battle over Amy Coney Barrett affected either party, and if so, in what way? It's certainly
I think her performance in those hearings, as measured polling in polls, seemed to increase her support among voters generally. I think it will probably marginally help Donald Trump and Republicans and some Republican Senate candidates. But, Mr. Trump, assuming that Judge Barrett is confirmed, as I expect she will be, has gotten 3 Supreme Court appointments in one 4-year period. That's a pretty high number. It's not as high as President Taft got. I think he had 5 in one 4-year period and ended up becoming Chief Justice himself the next time there was a Republican president. I think we'll continue to see that. I think the court packing issue may be important, and that's one of the things that I would ask Norm is, is that something that Nancy Pelosi wants to whip her Democrats, a Democratic majority in the House to support, or does it have the potential to be something like Obamacare, where she achieved a policy goal, but at some significant political cost?
Norm, how would you answer that?
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting dynamic. Charles Fried, the former Solicitor General under Reagan, had a very interesting piece on this in the New York Times. And what I would say is, assuming Barrett gets confirmed, which would come probably a week or less before an election in which we get a Democratic landslide or a huge victory, that will have some impact on attitudes among Democrats. What's more important is going to be the behavior of this new court. Michael mentioned earlier the failed court packing of Franklin Roosevelt. It actually, in many ways, was a great success for Franklin Roosevelt because it fired a warning shot across the bow of a court that had blocked many New Deal initiatives. And after this, the court changed. Will this be a court, and put aside Roe v. Wade or even the Affordable Care Act, that tries to put enormous constraints on what Congress and the presidency can do in terms of broader policy, what administrative agencies can do under what has been the Chevron doctrine and others that enable it to make all kinds of decisions delegated by Congress? Will it move back towards the Lochner era, the pre-New Deal era, that basically says the Commerce Clause doesn't allow government to do very much? If a Democratic House, Senate, and President find themselves thwarted, and if we see really draconian measures on voting rights, then I think you're going to see an enormous push towards adding seats to the court. And to some degree, it's going to be a reflection of a belief that the Merrick Garland nomination was handled in a fashion that was not legitimate, that having a vote a week before an election was not legitimate. That will raise a lot of hackles, but I don't see this happening for a period of time until we see how this court responds. And that's not clear. It's not clear whether John Roberts will be able to get one additional justice to go along to keep the court from moving in a more radical direction.
Henry, both Republicans and Democrats are very loyal to their party. Do you expect that Biden will get a higher share of Democratic voters in this election than Trump will get of Republicans?
That's what the polls are showing, but it would be a very small advantage. That it's people who still say they are Republican are very strongly in favor of the president, and people who are Democrat are nearly uniformly behind Biden. But while I expect that maybe it would be 96% of Democrats for Biden and 93% of Republicans for Trump, the Biden advantage will be small with respect to holding his party more than Trump holds his.
And a question for the whole panel: what groups are you watching most closely in terms of movement toward Trump or away from Trump as we get into the final stages of the campaign? Which voters are most important to you in terms of the election outcome?
I would say
one clearly important group is the so-called white non-college graduates, the people that kind of snuck up and elected Donald Trump in 2016. Such polling as we have of this group has suggested at least, that they're less supportive percentage-wise of Donald Trump than they were 4 years ago, and that's the primary reason why his vote is down. He's actually doing a little better in the polls among Black Americans and Hispanic Americans. I think that we need to learn more about the non-college whites as we have tended to categorize them. Some polls are still not differentiating or setting quotas for college grad whites and non-college whites, even though their voting behavior is very different, has been very different the last 5 years, because, hey, 20 years ago, they sort of voted the same. So why do we need to make a distinction? Well, we know now that we do, but shrewd observers like Nate Cohn of the New York Times Upshot Group has been warning us for 5 years that a lot of polls are not getting proper responses from these groups. And we do have these numbers that Henry, I think, referred to, which is when you look at the realclearpolitics.com average of the polling in target states, in the close states where we anticipate the election will be decided, Donald Trump is actually doing slightly better than against Joe Biden than he did against Hillary Clinton 4 years ago in those same states. Now, are those poll results commensurate? You can argue that either way. Is that the sole focus that we should have? Probably not. But it's an interesting phenomenon.
So
And
I would add three
I'd be
groups.
trying to learn more about what shall we call them, the J.D. Vance voters.
Okay, Norm.
Yeah, three groups that I would mention, Karlyn. First is older voters. We've seen quite a striking shift, at least in some polls, away from Trump. Whether that's a COVID response or something else, or how real it is, I don't know. But that's an interesting group. The second, of course, is suburban women. And that Donald Trump, when a rally would say, suburban women, please love me, please like me, is at least some indication that there's some concern there. And the third, which Michael alluded to, is, I would say, non-Mexican American Hispanic voters. Certainly that matters in Florida. We know it's Cuban Americans. Younger Cuban Americans have tended to move a little bit more towards Democrats, away from Republicans. But they're an important voting bloc in Florida. Venezuelan Americans and others from Central America, including some from Puerto Rico, who don't view themselves in quite the same way as some other Hispanic voters do. If Republicans can capture 40% or more of those voters, they could do quite well in some key states, including especially Florida.
Henry, you've talked a lot about blue collar Republicans, and in that group that Michael alluded to, the non-college educated voters, you've seen a big gender gap with women in that group moving away from Donald Trump. What are you looking at specifically? And I wonder if you could say something about the union vote. I noticed that Trump was in Janesville earlier in the week, big union town. Is he going to do as well as he did with union voters in 2020?
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's going to do as well as he did with union voters, because in part there was the issue of Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden is just not Hillary Clinton. What I'm going to try and look at over the next couple of weeks is the degree to which the samples of blue collar whites look like the sorts of blue collar whites that actually show up. That was looking in 2016. Even the samples that broke out, blue non-college whites, tended to show much higher support for Clinton than in fact were delivered. Polling error that Sean Trendy has pointed out tends to be not just not counting enough of the white non-college group, but getting the wrong types of white non-college voters. So what I would want to do is see whether or not that error is pointing out again, is that if there's any group I think that might be not answering polls, it would be the white non-college Trump-leaning Republican. And if it looks like polls are consistently off on that sample, that would be an early sign that maybe the Republican myth, largely, of a massive polling error might have some shreds of truth to it.
I wonder if the panelists have any questions for each other, and then we're going to turn to questions from our audience. You've answered them all.
Well, I would take a little issue with Norm and his history of the Supreme Court in the 1930s, which I think is not quite as clear cut a swing in time to save nine as he suggested. But also, when you look at a Supreme Court that is made up of members appointed by one party, and the court, by the time Roosevelt was in his third term in 1941, 8 of the 9 justices had been appointed by President Roosevelt. You start to find that the court is deciding different issues. Different issues are coming before them. Splits which had ordinarily not occurred in the court prior to that time start appearing. And you get a certain amount of, in the 1940s and 50s, personal animosity among Democratic appointees to the court, which is quite different from the kind of comedy and good personal feelings that have existed on the court over the last 20 years, and personified in particular by the friendship between the late Justice Scalia and the late Justice Ginsburg. So the court kind of evolves and focuses on different issues over time. And we'll see. I guess the other thing I would say is big money advantage for the Democrats. And I think that fortifies what Norm was saying about, gee, maybe they don't want to eviscerate a campaign finance system, which despite Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's complaints about dark money, has very much favored the Democratic Party on balance this year and in previous election cycles for the last 15 years. In ways that are out of line with the rhetoric that you hear from some of the liberal critics of campaign finance arrangements.
I guess my point, I think I do want to emphasize Norm's point, but also hook on to Henry's about the older voters. Again, older voters, I am watching, and in part because we wouldn't have expected this 2 years ago. If someone said, you know, Donald Trump's going to be doing a lot of work with older voters, I think that would have been a shock to people. But it also is the group that includes the highest number, or the largest percentage of white non-college voters. So if there's a part of the non-college white world that is falling away from Donald Trump, and those older voters are that, I mean, that's a story that we've seen it in the polls. But again, it should surprise us given all of our preconceptions going into this election at least a year ago.
Well, as I think Nate Cohn pointed out, this year's age 65 voters have a higher college graduate percentage than 4 years ago's over 65-year-old voters. You start getting reflections of that late 1960s and early 19th century, the 1970s increase in college enrollments. And so that underlines what John was just saying.
You know, we would be remiss, though, not to talk about the other end of the spectrum, the Gen Z and Gen Y voters, who have voted Democratic in very substantial numbers in the last couple of elections, are going to do so this time. And what we know from political socialization research is that if you vote for one party 2 or 3 times in a row as you just come of age and begin to vote, it tends to solidify your identification for a lifetime. If that's the case, Republicans are going to have another challenge looking at decades ahead. They're going to have a lot of work to do to get the generations of voters that are beginning to move more into the electorate and will vote more frequently.
And to support your point, Norm, in the new States of Change report, there is less evidence, it seems, in the past of the conservatizing of age of voters as they age. The first question from our audience, John, is for you, and this goes back to after the people vote. What would happen if Trump refuses to concede in this election?
Well, first, I'm going to say I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to have a clear result. It'll be likely, and a clear result will put pressure on either candidate to concede, both for them, but also the party would come along, I believe. So sure, if we have a very close election, a Bush v. Gore situation where we're fighting out tooth and nail, it's hard to say that it won't be really quite tense and ugly, that there'll be more ballots out there than there were because of the vote by mail. And that would be a very tough situation. But I really do believe that we're going to see a clear enough result and a clear enough winner and loser and a concession. And again, constitutionally, the term ends January 20th at noon. Some question of how quickly we can resolve that election, but really there's no question about a term ending at that point, and someone else, either Trump with a second term or Biden, or perhaps some election dispute that we're not sure who should be president, someone else is going to fill that next term, not someone staying on past the time.
Henry, this question from the audience is for you. Should Trump lose, what becomes of Trumpism and namely populism? I know you've watched this current not only in the United States, but also around the globe.
Populism is going to remain strong around the globe because the system isn't working for a large number of people. I don't necessarily identify populism as purely a Trumpian phenomena. There's certainly populism of the left. I think that's the best way to describe the rise in socialism. Some places there's populism of the center, where a non-ideological outsider like the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic takes control. We're going to go through a very difficult few years with respect to COVID. Unless there really is a miracle vaccine, the elites are going to continue to counsel suppressing economic activity to control the disease. And so one thing I know about human history is that there's only so much of this that people will take, particularly if there's a charismatic outsider, left, right, or center, who says that the system doesn't work for you anymore and it's time to go somewhere different. So I expect that populism will resurge in the next couple of years. And in the United States, the things that drove Trumpism were largely not personality dependent. They were genuine concerns that people had. They're reflected in polls for years, if you bothered to look at them, which most people didn't. And Trump came along and identified himself with key concerns that people had that existed before him that are not going to go away, and in some cases may be exacerbated pretty sharply after a defeat. So I expect that in the United States, in the Republican Party, there will be a debate over the meaning of Trump's legacy, and we will see that play out before us. But globally, I think populism will, after a brief abatement now, as people are hoping the elites can get this under control, when it demonstrates that they can't, at least not with their current tool book, then I expect populism to greatly resurge in the early next couple of years.
Michael, this is a question about something you said. You talked about the fact that Trump was running ahead of some of the GOP candidates like Martha McSally and Joni Ernst, but Trump is relatively unpopular in a lot of these states. What is the explanation for this, given his unpopularity?
Well, I think, as I said, I think one of the factors may be that it is harder for an individual senator, an individual Republican senator, to establish a record of her or his own in a period of time when you've got the news media full of Donald Trump and full of denunciations of Donald Trump, of course. And I think it's harder for them to establish that. I note that Susan Collins, currently running 4 points behind in the state of Maine, had established that kind of persona for herself. But even in her case, she seems to be falling behind. But 4 points behind does not mean at this stage that it's impossible for her to win. It means that it's less likely than not. So let's wait and see on the results there. But I think that tends to explain it. It also says the challenger has choice of ground in this situation. You've got the Democratic Twitterverse and very many Democratic officials in safe states are itching to add 2, 4, or even 6 seats to the Supreme Court and fill them up with their people. But when you actually ask Senate Democratic candidates who are challenging Republican senators in close races what their position is, they fudge. They try and stay away from it. They want a more moderate persona than the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gives them, who indeed may take on Chuck Schumer and could conceivably defeat him for Senate in 2022 in the New York Democratic primaries. So consequently, the out party has choice of ground there, and I think they're taking intelligent advantage of it.
Norm, do you expect any leadership changes in the House on either the Democratic or the Republican side? And I think, for example, of the age of the leaders of the Democratic team, and also on the Republican side, is Kevin McCarthy safe? And what are your expectations? And any of the panel can take this question, but Norm, let's start with you.
I don't see any changes on the Democratic side, in part because if you succeed, it's very hard to oust your leaders. Now, that would be different if, for example, the Democrats fell short in the Senate of getting a majority. But even there, I would expect that they'll stay with their leadership team. The same is true in the House, although, as you say, the top three leaders are certainly a lot older. They're cultivating. Pelosi has a strong hold, much stronger than she did in 2018 on her conference, on her caucus. They're cultivating a group of younger leaders to move along. And one, of course, to keep an eye on is Hakeem Jeffries. If Republicans lose 10 or 15 seats in the House, I think we're going to see a pretty vigorous challenge for Kevin McCarthy, probably coming from his right. And there are a lot of people on the Jim Jordan wing of the party who would probably expect under those circumstances that they want to take a much more aggressive approach against Biden and Democrats. And on the Senate side, of course, John Cornyn has at least a little bit of a contest for his seat in Texas. Mitch McConnell, despite having an extraordinarily well-financed opponent, is still in Kentucky and is very likely to be coming back. And I don't see any challenge to him as the Republican leader of the Senate.
Any other comments on the leadership team on either side?
Well, it is sort of extraordinary that the top three Democratic leaders in the House are or soon will be over 80 years old. They all seem to be pretty vigorous and have had, as Norm notes, a certain amount of recent success. But it's pretty fascinating. I remember when Sam Rayburn turned 80. In fact, I think he died before he turned 80. So this is 80 is the new 60 or something like that in the House of Representatives.
Another question, do you think there's any hope for a COVID package before the election, or is it really dead on arrival?
I think that if Donald Trump decides that he doesn't want to bail out New York, New Jersey, California, and Illinois out of the pension problems that their public employee unions have plunged them into, there won't be a COVID package, because Nancy Pelosi wants that, because that's important for the Democratic Party. Those are the groups that are really running policy for the Democratic Party. We're closing schools despite minimal health risks to the people involved, and despite the harm it does to low-income children. So they're in the driver's seat.
This is such an interesting dynamic, Karlyn, and it's a reflection of the different interests of Senate Republicans and the president. The president at this point has said multiple times, and I think means it, that he wants a huge COVID package because he's doing everything he can to get leverage heading into this final stage of the election campaign. And as we know, that also includes the highly dubious, in terms of legality, question of sending $200 bonus checks to seniors to help pay for their prescription drugs. But he's called for a package that's even bigger than the CARES Act, the one that the Democrats have proposed. And we know that Nancy Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin are still deep in negotiations. I don't think the odds are great that they will come up with a big package, but if they did, it would be going up directly against what Mitch McConnell wants to do. The last thing he wants is to have a big package that he would force Senate Republicans to vote on, and where Democrats would vote for it, and they could only block it if they filibustered a package endorsed by their own president. So probably won't happen, and more than likely what we're going to see is the pretty modest package that McConnell is going to bring up on the Senate floor that Democrats will block, and they'll try to use that as an issue in the campaign.
Any other comments on that? We have a question about the New York Post story on the purported Hunter Biden laptop computer. Do you see it having any effect on the campaign?
No.
It's a sort of thing that Republicans who are already going to support Trump are seizing on. I doubt it'll have an effect on the campaign unless something comes out that hasn't already come out, the sense of more, something that would more directly implicate Joe Biden. And I think most people are partisans and are viewing these stories through their own lenses, and the person in the middle, the few that there are, have not really focused on this to say, hey, this really is something that I should be paying attention to, as opposed to this is just part of the normal back and forth and noise that I've grown weary of over the past 4 years.
I think there's a potential effect on regulation of the major internet companies. I mean, this is a sort of astonishing effort by Twitter and Facebook to censor news and to block dissemination of news, and against certainly the spirit of the First Amendment, all in the name of we know better what's there, and our 85 to 95% Democratic people who do the censoring have decided that you shouldn't learn this. I think this is going to increase Republican support for changes in Section 230, which protects these companies' commercial interests. And there's also demand on the part of many Democrats for something similar. So I think it has a potential for a significant effect on what have become, the companies. This has been, the COVID crisis has been a great crisis for Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, and Google. They've been doing great in this as small businesses have been going out of existence. And I think that there may be some backlash along the way, and it could become bipartisan as a result of the actions, of the rather astonishing actions of Facebook and Twitter.
Not surprisingly, I have a somewhat different perspective. We have 50 top intelligence officials, formerly serving in the government, saying that this is very, very likely to be Russian disinformation, which is why the internet companies have been a little reluctant to go with it. And it's, of course, also why Fox News, which had the story early on, said they weren't going to be the ones who would go with it. What I find more interesting about this now is this larger dynamic over Hunter Biden as somebody with a serious drug problem, and how that plays with the larger electorate, including an electorate, including the J.D. Vance type voters who faced all of these challenges with addiction in their own families, and whether that the sort of attacks on Biden, Hunter for his drug addiction and his father for supporting him, will have a backlash effect. I have no idea whether this will penetrate or resonate at all, but it's a very interesting contrast in terms of the family dynamics that we see out there.
We only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to turn to each of the panelists and just ask what you're going to be watching most closely in the next 14 days. Why don't we start with you, John?
Well, I guess I'm going to be watching for signs of whether perhaps the race is tightening up a bit. I think the lead for Democrats and for Joe Biden is really quite large. So even a tightening might not mean that the president is back in the race. But I think in particular for thinking about the after election governance. Again, if there is a Biden win with even a very narrow majority in the Senate, a 50-50 election, that makes a big difference for the way we're going to govern in the future. And again, if there's a big Biden win, that's not only a much more enthusiastic Democratic majority, but also in the states, potential for changes in redistricting that will really be quite significant. So I think the sort of size of the victory, even if it isn't a Trump win, but how narrow things are in the Senate and out in the state legislatures will make a big difference in terms of the action we see post January 20th.
Michael, what are you watching most closely?
Well, I'm going to be curious to see whether Donald Trump talks more than he has so far in this campaign about issues that really propelled him into winning the presidency in 2016, which would be immigration and illegal immigration in particular, and trade. Those are the issues where he connected in many ways with this white non-college graduate cohort, which enabled him to win surprise victories in Pennsylvania Michigan and Wisconsin, and their 46 electoral votes made him the president. And it's a little bit astonishing that he hasn't taken it up very much anymore. I think there is a potential for change in immigration, and I would go back to something that Norm mentioned, which is that he predicted that Democrats are going to take measures to try to prevent a rush of immigrants, supposed asylum seekers or refugees coming to the streaming over the Mexican border, as we saw about 18 months ago. Will Trump raise the specter of that kind of an issue when, it's pretty clear that the Democrats have been opposing every effort that the Trump administration has been made to prevent that kind of onrush. So we'll see if that comes to pass. I just note that, it's fascinating to look at these poll numbers. On the one hand, we're seeing Joe Biden 9 or 10 points ahead in national polls. We're seeing we're seeing polls, at least some polls in states that were pivotal in 2016, being very close or within range of possible upset result for Donald Trump this time. It's a fascinating situation. I think one thing that people have not grasped is the unusual role of our largest state, California, in affecting the popular vote. If you go back, as I've done, and look at the largest state in our presidential elections from the 1820s, when the popular vote became important, when New York from the 1820s to the 1960s, California since the 1960s has been the largest state. Up until 2000, the largest state was always within about 5 points of the national average. It was seriously contested. New York was a target state for years. California was a target state. Now we've got the largest state voting way off on the left. California was #2 state for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And so that, every national poll that we see includes these numbers: 6 points for Joe Biden from California, 3 points for Donald Trump from California, or maybe only 2. And that illustrates that we may have again, if Trump wins or in future races, a situation where the popular vote plurality winner does not win the Electoral College, because after that person carries the 55 or 54 votes in California, all the huge margin of popular votes they have there doesn't help them win anymore.
Norm and Henry, very quickly, but I want to remind the audience, we'll be back on November 5th, midday. You'll certainly be told about the time very soon, but quick comments about what you're watching most closely. And I want to thank the panelists for just a wonderful discussion of a huge number of issues in a short period of time. Norm.
I would just raise one thing, which is COVID, and both the way in which it will play out over the next 10 days. The largest outbreak and what's now going to be a huge problem is in states like North and South Dakota, but states where they've refused to take steps as a government to try and bring in some of the public health measures. And what happens on the election itself, if the infectious disease specialists are right, and we see this peaking as a problem right around Election Day, is that going to have an effect disrupting the election itself on Election Day? And how would Trump react, given that far more of his voters are likely to turn out on Election Day itself, if it turns out that a lot of people can't vote because they're sick or because the polling places are just not adequate?
Henry, final thoughts from you.
I'll be looking to see whether or not there's any evidence of polling error. I think we need to be open to that possibility. Just in 2019 in Australia, every poll showed the Labour Party was going to win. Even the exit poll showed the Labour Party was going to win. The Liberal National Coalition won. It was a swing of 7 points on the margin between what the pre-election and the pre-election poll versus the reality is. I'll also be looking to see whether or not these registration changes matter. That there is clear evidence, Dave Wasserman wrote about it, that Republicans are doing better than Democrats in key states. One thing I'll be looking at is, are the registration numbers rising as a share of voter eligible population? outside of the major metro areas, because that would be an early sign that the Trump attempt to expand the electorate is working. I don't know what the numbers are, but in the next 2 weeks, I'll dig into both and see what I come up with.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the panelists and to the audience. We're very grateful for your participation in this election watch. It's been going on for a long time, and we look forward to seeing you on November 5th. Thank you all very much.